I don't really expect an answer, but when do you think the lockout might end?
That's the question, right? I mean, I don't have any sort of
Yeah.
inside information. I go off what my colleagues report on The Athletic, uh, and kind of historical precedent and the nature of deadlines in the baseball industry. So I'm not expecting spring training to start on time. I don't think anyone is. And then you're probably looking at closer towards the end of February, early March, and like maybe a best case report time, right? I mean, we still have a second off season to go, still very wide gaps in this round of collective bargaining. So, like, I'm not booking my flight to Arizona or anything like that. I think we're all kind of waiting around at this point. I think lopping off games from the regular season schedule is probably too early at this point. I think it's just, if you go back to the pandemic season, and that was a real kind of bitter battle between owners and players, and they got what, like 3 weeks spring training 2.0. So like
Hmm.
there's like they can
Yeah.
accelerate
Yeah.
things, they can maybe massage a few rules and kind of roster requirements to help kind of get them there so that each side isn't missing out on regular season paychecks or commitments to TV partners and sponsors. But you're right. I mean, it's the question, and there's not a whole lot of optimism to hang your hat on at this point.
But they got a nice deal done with Stroman for 3 years and 71 million. It kind of re-energized the fan base, as you could see on Twitter, just the reaction and how exciting it seems to be. So kind of a good move, not just on the field, but kind of, I guess, in this Cubs offseason so far, which has been obviously on hold for now.
Yeah, you're right. Well, I mean, that's the type of move that you market towards your fan base, that it sets up other complementary moves to build out your roster. A guy pre-COVID you could bring out to a Cubs convention and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
I think this move was largely, like you say, in reaction to, and maybe with a little sense of desperation. Like, Cubs really needed a lot of pitching, and that was flying off the shelves. And I think, in one sense, it was telling and a positive sign that they didn't overthink this. Like, he's a really good pitcher. They have a lot of money to spend. They didn't have to go 5 years or give up a draft pick to sign him. But I also think it was kind of rushed for a front office that at times maybe overthinks things, or like had these elaborate
Yeah.
presentations to free agents and talking about how they followed,
Yeah.
this guy for years. And this is just kind of like Stroman getting a call from his agent being like, dude, you got to go to LAX. We got to get you on a red eye flight.
Do you feel like the Cubs, because we heard the rumors that they might be linked to Correa? Do you feel like the Cubs, it would make sense for them to go all in on Correa because obviously he could help them with their contention window, or would they be better served maybe utilizing that money? We're talking, 300 million or whatever, some of that anyway, for other players, maybe dole that out across a couple. Like, what do you think might be the best in their best interest? And I know, like, again, with the term, they might be looking more if they could get a guy for, say, 6 years versus 10, but Correa is probably going to command at least 6 or more.
I mean, does Correa make sense? Absolutely. Like, could you talk yourself into it? Sure. But is that like where the front office is focused on? Like, no. I mean, we can, with all this extra time on our hands during the lockout and without other stuff to kind of distract us, you can wonder about shorter terms, opt outs, getting creative. But like, that's not what happens with 27-year-old all-star shortstops. Like, I mean, historically speaking, and I don't think Carlos Correa switched representation to Scott Boras to get like a 7-year deal. Like, Scott Boras got Corey Seager paid. He got Marcus Simeon paid. And, the Cubs are not the only team out there with some money to spend, particularly once this new labor deal happens. That historically means owners have a degree of cost certainty and are willing to open up.
Yeah, I was curious, whenever the lockout does end, would you anticipate maybe a flurry of signings once it ends, or it's just hard to say because we got to figure out what the CBA will look like anyway?
Logically, there'd have to be a flurry of activity because we're probably going to look at a really compressed timeline. So, like, I don't know if it's, they announce it and then there's, a ton of signings like the next morning, but there isn't going to be a whole lot of time to be kind of negotiating back and forth. And I think the owners probably see that as an advantage. I think that's why you saw players with options and leverage really force the issue to get that done before the transactions freeze. And so I think it's hard to kind of project too much onto this other than, it'll be baseball will be back in the news in a big way after really kind of what's probably going to be an ugly labor battle.
I just love the line that you had about Cubs fans appear to be very open minded to Hoyer's approach, or at least a little more optimistic than the negativity found on Twitter, Cubs Twitter, because I thought that's so perfect. I'm on Twitter, I see what feels just like an overwhelming amount of good or maybe bad toxic stuff, and I'm like, this can't be the full pulse of what is out there in reality. But sometimes it just feels like Twitter, it's all negative. So I thought that's such a great line because, Twitter is can be a toxic place. It can be a great place, but it just feels like everybody comes to this one website to yell at or get into these fights or arguments about stuff.
But also, like, if people are negative on Twitter, I don't have an issue with that. Like, fans
Oh,
can
yeah. Yeah, for
feel how
sure.
they want to feel, and like things haven't been positive around the Cubs. Like it
Yeah.
has
Right.
been.
Yeah.
They had a bad team, and they traded away some iconic players. And while a lot of this makes sense on paper, they still haven't
Hmm.
delivered. You're looking at a significant block of time where they were really bearing down to um, make him a Cub for life. And so obviously
Hmm.
he could have ultimately walked and bet on himself. Perhaps the Cubs would not have. Maybe they would have felt like that was close to our best offer, and it could have fizzled out. We'll never know. But he
Yeah.
was the guy where they were heavily involved and never really got a chance to see it through. And then I'd say the other trade or the other move, pandemic related, is the Darvish trade, and that um, maybe you could have made the case that you sell high on a guy like that after the front office had been criticized for holding on to guys too long, and we know how those nine-figure 6-year deals for pitchers. So you try and go all in on the front, and then you know that there's going to be this downside, and that maybe that reset would have happened, but pandemic finances played a huge part in that decision, and so who knows how they would have looked at the landscape without that. I
Yeah.
think maybe things would have run their course, and that they
I guess what I'm curious about is like they bring in Carter Hawkins, who has a track record of developing players with the Guardians, and they've had a lot of really good pitchers back, in during their last few years, really and beyond. But I guess I'm curious. Like it sounds great when they have like this pitch lab, and all these different people, Craig Bresla, whoever, different titles. They're all like trying to kind of get together and figure out the best course of action.
yeah, I think it's totally fair to be skeptical and wonder when we're going to see the results, and also to question some of the process when the organizations, uh, some of the organization's best pitching prospects were injured for the entire year. And there's a lot of circumstance and to that. There are variables, there are unknowns. Like there's not like one single theory around this, but you know, it's going to be time as the Cubs are doing this kind of reboot here that they're going to have to get more out of their internal pitching systems than they have in the past. And there are so many layers to this, from changes they made in scouting and drafting to kind of these high performance systems they've put in place, some of the pitching philosophies you alluded to earlier, Will.